What if I told you the British Empire, the most powerful empire the world had ever seen, didn't fall on a battlefield but in a quiet Washington office filled with cigar smoke burning documents and a single secret bill that changed history? What if the real cost of World War II wasn't measured in bombs, but in debt so massive it brought an empire to its knees? Stay with me, because this is the story of how the United States quietly bankrupted the British Empire, and why almost nobody alive today knows the full truth. The year was 1939. Europe shook beneath the weight of war drums, and the British Empire, stretching across continents, ruling over hundreds of millions, stood at the edge of a storm it had barely survived once before. But behind the polished boots, the marching bands, and Winston Churchill's thunderous speeches, there was fear. Not fear of Hitler alone, but fear of numbers. In a small, dim treasury room in London, surrounded by stacks of ledgers, sat Sir Henry Balfour, a mid-level British financial officer. He was no general, no politician, just a tired man with ink-stained fingers and a mind full of calculations that kept him awake at night. On his desk, two numbers haunted him: £4.5 billion the cost of the last war. £137 million what Britain currently had available to fight this one. For the first time in his life, Henry felt the empire he grew up idolizing trembling. To understand Britain's panic, you have to understand America's position. The U.S. had a series of neutrality acts. These laws essentially said, if you want to buy our weapons, you pay in cash, and you carry them home yourself. No credit, no loans. It was cash and carry. For Britain, this was a disaster. Every bomb, every rifle, every boot and tin of food that Britain needed to survive was paid for in gold or US dollars, and Britain was running out of both. Fast, the British were sending desperately needed gold to the US. That lightning speed so fast that workers in Ottawa, where the gold was loaded onto ships, joked the vaults were leaking like a broken pipe. Yet the warehouses in America kept sending back the same message: payment insufficient. Britain was liquidating everything it owned. They sold off their foreign investments, their railways in Argentina, their manufacturing plants in America. It was like a desperate family pawning the silverware, then the furniture, then the house itself, just to keep the lights on for one more day. Meanwhile, across the ocean, America stood neutral but watching. In Washington, a young American economist named Eleanor Brooks drafted reports for President Roosevelt. She wasn't powerful. She wasn't famous. But she was one of the first to recognize the truth. If Britain falls, Europe falls. But if Britain survives, it will be owned by its debt. She said it quietly, but the White House heard her. This wasn't just about winning a war. It was about shaping the world that came after. American officials saw a once-in-a-century opportunity. For generations, the British Empire and its pound sterling had dominated global finance. Now, the US dollar was poised to take the throne. The war was Britain's crisis, but it was America's opening. And as the bombs fell on London in the Blitz, Britain's leaders were forced to make the most humiliating decision of their imperial lives. They would have to beg the United States for help. Churchill didn't answer immediately. There were things an empire never imagined it would have to sell. But the truth was clear. They had no choice. And so began the negotiations that would become the Lend-Lease Act, a friendly-sounding policy with an iron hook buried inside. The public story was simple and brilliant. Roosevelt compared it to lending your neighbor a garden hose if their house was on fire. You don't ask for $5. You just want the hose back when the fire is out. It was a beautiful analogy. It was also completely misleading. Lend-Lease wasn't a loan of a garden hose. It was a fire sale. Britain would receive weapons, vehicles, ships, food, fuel, whatever they needed. but they would pay later. They catch Article 7. This small clause, buried in the agreement, was the real price. It stipulated that Britain had to dismantle its imperial preference system. For decades, Britain had traded freely with its colonies and dominions, like Canada, Australia, and India, with low tariffs, creating a closed economic bloc. This system was the financial engine of the British Empire. Article the 7th demanded that Britain open up its empire to free trade. In other words, open it up to American businesses. America wasn't just lending a hose. It was asking for the keys to the house. Back in London, Sir Henry Balfour, our fictional treasury officer, saw the numbers. He understood what was happening. As Lend-Lease supplies began to flow, the Empire's financial independence was flowing out. Britain was becoming a subsidiary of the United States. He knew that even if they won the war, the Britain that emerged would be a shadow of its former self. The bill was going to be impossible to pay. And the cost wasn't just financial, it was strategic. As part of the deal, America gained access to British naval bases all across the Atlantic. These weren't leased for the duration of the war. They were 99-year leases. American flags were now flying over British territory. In one stroke, the U.S. had acquired a network of strategic outposts that secured its dominance over the Atlantic, a role previously held by the Royal Navy for centuries. Churchill called it a decidedly unneutral act, but he had to swallow his pride. Britain was trading pieces of its empire for survival. As the war raged on, Britain's debt spiraled into astronomical figures. The total value of Lend-Lease aid was over $50 billion more than $700 billion in today's money. Britain received the lion's share, about $31 billion. Think about that number. At the end of the war, Britain, the supposed victor, was more financially ruined than defeated Germany. While America's economy had doubled in size, Britain's was shattered. The war ended in 1945. Victory parades filled the streets of London. But just 2 days after Japan's surrender, the new American president, Harry Truman, abruptly cut off Lend-Lease. The garden hose was taken back, while the embers were still glowing. Britain was left standing in the ruins, with a shattered economy, a global empire it could no longer afford to police, and a crippling debt to the United States. They had to take another loan, the Anglo-American Loan of 1946, just to avoid total collapse. But this loan came with even stricter conditions, forcing Britain to make the pound sterling freely convertible to the US dollar. The result was a currency crisis that nearly bankrupted the country all over again. The final payment on these World War II loans wasn't made until December 29th. Those mille for 60 years after the war, British taxpayers were still paying America for the price of their survival. And that quiet transaction, born in desperation and negotiated in secrecy, did what no army ever could. It dismantled the largest empire in history, not with a bang, but with a bill. The British Lion had survived the war, but it had been declawed and defanged by its closest ally. The age of empire was over. The American century had begun. It was the summer of 1942, and while bombs fell across Europe, another war was being fought on paper. In a quiet London office, a British official named Henry Balfour stared at a stack of documents fresh from Washington. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of tanks, millions of tons of food, enough fuel to power a nation. He felt a wave of nausea. "This can't be right," he muttered. But his colleague standing behind him confirmed his fears. "It is right, Henry. Every last digit." Britain's debt to the United States had reached a level unprecedented in human history. No empire had ever owed so much to another nation. Buried deep within the documents, on the very last page, was a single sentence that sealed their fate. "Full repayment shall be required upon the conclusion of hostilities." Henry buried his face in his hands. It hit him with the force of a physical blow. Britain wasn't just renting equipment to survive the war. It was mortgaging the entire future of its empire. Across the Atlantic, in a bustling Washington, D.C. office, A young analyst named Eleanor Brooks reviewed the same numbers, but with a complex mix of triumph and unease. "Are we saving them?" she asked her superior, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up from his desk, a cold, thin smile playing on his lips. "We are shaping the next century, Eleanor." The truth was stark and undeniable. The United States was stepping onto the world stage as a new superpower, and its rise was being financed by the desperation of its closest ally. As the war raged on, year after grueling year, the British Empire began to hemorrhage its most valuable assets, just to keep fighting. It was like watching a grand old family forced to pawn its heirlooms one by one. Plantations in the West Indies were sold off. Railways in Argentina, once the pride of British engineering, were transferred to new owners. Mines in Africa that had fueled the Industrial Revolution were signed away. Entire territories, symbols of global dominance, were quietly relinquished. Piece by piece, the empire that had taken centuries to build was being dismantled, not by invading armies, but by accountants and lawyers. Finally, in 1945, the war was won. The Nazi regime had collapsed. Europe was liberated. A collective sigh of relief echoed across the free world. But for Britain, the victory was bittersweet. In a mahogany-paneled office in Downing Street, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was presented with the final bill. He read the summary once, then twice, then a third time. Each reading felt like swallowing shards of glass. The total debt was astronomical, equivalent to over $40 billion in today's money. It was, at that time, the single largest debt ever owed by one nation to another. The room was silent for a long, heavy moment. Churchill, the bulldog of Britain, the man whose defiance had inspired millions, looked suddenly frail. When he finally spoke, his voice was raspy, aged beyond his years. "So this," he murmured to the room, and perhaps to history itself, "is the price of survival." The decades that followed were a painful, slow-motion collapse. Britain, strangled by its war debt, began the painful process of dismantling its colonies. The military, once the most powerful on earth, was slashed. One by one, Britain withdrew from its global commitments, its role as a world leader fading like an old photograph. The country lurched from one economic crisis to another, the roots of each problem tracing back to that monumental debt, the quiet pact that had saved the nation but doomed its empire. Meanwhile, the United States emerged from the war not just victorious, but stronger and wealthier than ever before. Its cities were untouched by bombs, its industries booming. It had become the world's new center of gravity, the undisputed leader of the post-war era. Years later, an elderly Henry Balfour, the official who had first seen the horrifying numbers, took a walk along the River Thames. As the sun set over a city that had survived the Blitz, he whispered to himself, a thought that had haunted him for decades. "We didn't lose the empire on the battlefield. We signed it away on paper." History doesn't always turn on the sound of explosions or the clash of armies. Sometimes, its greatest shifts happen in the silence of a room, with the stroke of a pen. They happen with quiet decisions made by exhausted men trying to save their countries from one existential threat, only to stumble into another. Britain survived the Second World War, a testament to its courage and resilience. But in doing so, it unknowingly passed the torch, crowning a new superpower. And that is how the United States bankrupted the British Empire, not with bombs or bullets, but with a bill so large, it redrew the map of the world. Thank you for watching. If you found this piece of hidden history fascinating, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next video. See you next time.